All right, well, you can grab a seat. Children, you guys are free. We have kids' church in the fellowship hall. We've got preschool over here on, what is this, the west wing of the church? The north wing of the church? West wing, there we go. I'm directionally challenged. All this GPS usage. And then, just so you guys know, Pastor Steve, I spoke to him last night. They had a great time at family camp. He said there were so many people there, they almost had to turn people away because they didn't have room for everyone, but they made it work. There were, I'm just be thankful that they had a good weekend. And Pastor Sylvia is in Africa visiting family, and she's going to be going to, I forget the name of the country. Can someone help? Cameroon, thank you. She's going to be doing some ministry in Cameroon, and it sounds like they had a few issues with their flight, but they made it. Everything's going to be okay. And I just want to welcome you. Thank you for coming. 4th of July weekend. I know sometimes things are busy and it's hard, but you made it. You're here. We are going to be talking about a story that you may have heard 1,000 times in your life, especially if you've grown up in the church. And sometimes when this happens, your brain is like, oh, I know that already, and it stops thinking. It shuts down, kind of checks out. You know what I'm saying? Raise your hand if you're like, oh, yeah. That happens like 80% of the time I'm in church. Okay, you guys are not being honest. That's okay. I won't ask you to embarrass yourself. But I will be honest. When I hear stories, especially stories that pull from the story of the prodigal son, my brain wants to disconnect because it's like, dude, I've heard that story like so many times. I've read it. I've read books about it. And I just want to point that out because that's going to be happening for some of you today when we tell this story. And if you could notice it and correct it and focus, because I believe a lot of times when we talk about this story, we focus on the things that Jesus wasn't trying to focus on in this story. So I want to kind of highlight that, some of the things that Jesus was focusing on so that we can pull some good stuff out of it that maybe, hopefully, is going to be new to your ears. So let me see if I can turn this puppy on. Maybe. I might need help. I'll let you know when I need to advance the slide. Unless I could get someone, Ben, can you help me out? Thank you. You see, they hired young people to the church in the hopes that they'd be able to fix all the technology stuff, but I'm 42. I end up needing Ben's help every time, so. Oh, there's a power switch on the side. Thank you. We got it. You see, that's why we need Ben. All right, so today's sermon is the prodigal father, accepting the invitation to become more than lost sons and daughters. And the picture that I have up there is Rembrandt's The Return of the Prodigal Son, and I've talked about this so much. If there are any teenagers in here, you've seen this picture. I've got it in my office. I bring it down, and I bring it out to the fellowship hall when I preach about it. But in my opinion, this is one of the best versions of the story of the prodigal son that exists. And we'll talk about it in a little bit. The first story of the prodigal son in the Bible takes place in Genesis chapters 27 through 33. I don't know if you knew this. You see, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger son desired the blessing that would normally be passed on to his older brother. So he conspired to steal the blessing from his brother. He deceived his father, stole the blessing from his brother, and fled to a faraway land out of fear for his life, that his brother would kill him. And the tragedy of this story of the prodigal son is the father never got to see his son again. He passed without ever holding his grandchildren, without ever meeting the wives that his son ended up marrying. In this faraway land, he was manipulated and taken advantage of. He was lied to, cheated, and eventually fled out of fear that his life was in danger. And he decided to come back home. God told him to return to his homeland, and the younger brother was terrified. What's going to happen when I go back? My brother has inherited all the lands of my father. What is he going to do to me when I go back home? And so he starts going out of his way to I'm going to send this man gifts. I'm going to send him goats and sheep and herds and flocks. I'm going to send him as much as he can to earn his favor, to know that I am coming in peace. And his brother sends 500 troops to come out and meet him, and Jacob is terrified. But when he sees his older brother, this is what it says in Scripture. As he approached his older brother, Jacob bowed to the ground 7 times before him. Then Esau ran to meet him, embraced him, threw his arms around his neck, and kissed him, and they both wept. And later on, Jacob says, "What a relief it is to see your friendly smile. It is like seeing the face of God." In this story, I don't know if you know this, Jesus is a genius, okay? I feel like it's kind of strange to say that in church, but you should read this story, and when you end up reading the story of the prodigal son in Luke, you should be like, oh, okay, wow, Jesus, I see what you're doing, because Jesus is speaking to a group of people who have read this story their entire lives, and they're going to notice all of these different parallels. They're going to be like, oh, so let me just point out some of the similarities in this story before we go on. Both stories feature 3 main players, father and two sons. Both feature one of the younger son receiving a blessing or inheritance. Both stories, the younger son receives the inheritance before it's due. In both stories, the younger son is estranged from his family members. In both stories, the younger son runs away to a far land. The younger son faces hardship while he is away in this faraway land in both stories. In both stories, and this is the only time that this pattern of 3 appears in the entire Bible. In both stories, the younger son is greeted with running, embracing, and kissing. Okay? So that pattern of 3 only appears 2 times. Where one individual witnesses to see someone, he runs to greet them, embraces them, and kisses them. And the people that Jesus told this story to, you didn't have to explain all this to them. They were listening, and they're like, okay, wow, I see what you're doing there. That's brilliant. Because the story of Jacob is one of the foundational stories of Israel's identity as a people. Throughout the Bible, and this is true, if you open up I was just reading a random verse in Isaiah and I saw this happen. The people of Israel are referred to as Jacob throughout the story of the Bible. When God speaks to his people, often he uses the phrase, "Oh, Jacob." And sometimes he says that in blessing and compassion, and sometimes he says that in judgment. But the title of Jacob represents all of God's people. They see themselves as a main character in this first story of the prodigal son. Every ethnic Jew in the world has a common set of ancestors, and Jacob is the first common ancestor that they all share, because he's the father of the 12 tribes. And so, when Jesus retells this story, he is speaking to the Pharisees, descendants of Jacob, people who had memorized the Torah. Do you think they noticed what he was doing? Yes. So the question that I want us to ask us is, why is Jesus retelling the story of Jacob in this way, and why should I care? Okay? Pastor Justin, that's cool. You noticed something really neat when you were reading the Bible. Why does it matter? And that's what I want us to talk about this morning, okay? Why is Jesus intentionally retelling a story and putting a twist on it when he retells it? And this is my first point this morning. Asking which sibling am I when you read this story is the wrong question. And that's the way you are trained to read this story, all right? We're trained in church to be like, which of the siblings am I? Or, when I was growing up, that wasn't the question they wanted us to ask. They knew. They were telling us, you are the younger son, and you need to get right with your father. He's ready to hold you, right? And they would highlight my sinfulness. And you know what? That's not bad, okay? That's not wrong. And I'm not trying to criticize anyone who's done that, or if you've been like, man, this story was transformational in my life. I don't want to take away from that. But when Jesus is telling this story, he is not inviting the people he's speaking to ask that question, which sibling am I? He's messing with their perception of themselves and trying to challenge them to become something more. And I just want to point out, there's something about being the younger son in the story of the prodigal son. It feels good, right? Like, I've messed up so bad, but my dad still loves me. Like, I have ruined things so spectacularly, and he just wants to hold me, and he will take me back at any moment. Like, that is a beautiful part of the story. And we want to be that younger son. But when we read the story, we don't really want to be anyone else in that story sometimes. And if you've never felt the love that the Father has for you truly, okay? If you've never experienced that, I want you to talk to me or an elder or a person on staff so we can disciple you into that. But that's not actually going to be the point of my sermon this morning. So if you're like, I've never felt the love of God, when people talk about that, that sounds just like religious gobbledygook. Come talk to me. We'll pray together, and we'll step into a process of discipleship. But that's not our focus this morning. When Jesus is telling this story, he wasn't speaking to a room full of lost sinners. He was speaking to a group of faithful religious people who had memorized the story. In Luke chapter 15, the chapter that the story of the prodigal son is in, it sets up what's going on. It sets the scene for us. Tax collectors and other notorious sinners often came to listen to Jesus teach. Because of this, the Pharisees and teachers of religious law complained that he was associating with such sinful people, even eating with them. And so to teach them a lesson, Jesus told them 3 stories. First, he tells them the story about a lost sheep and how a good shepherd will leave his flock to go rescue a lost sheep. Then he talks about a woman who loses 10% of her wealth and the joy she feels when she rediscovers it. And then talk about pounding a point home with the story of the prodigal son. To drive this point home, he tells a story about the wayward son Jacob. And he changes the ending. The younger son comes home, and the father rushes out to meet him. The father embraces him, kisses him, and throws a feast to celebrate. And the Pharisees identify with Jacob. And when they hear the story of the prodigal son, they're thinking, oh yeah, we're the younger son. We're the younger son. Like, yeah, the story of Jacob is the story of us, God's people. He rescued us when we were enslaved. He went to Egypt and he fought for us and he embraced us and he brought us into his fold. Jesus has designed this story to trick the Pharisees, and that's what I want to point out. Because he's showing to them that they aren't the younger son, that they're the older son. Meanwhile, the older son was in the fields working, and when he returned home, he heard music and dancing in the house. And he asked one of the servants what was going on. Your brother is back, he was told, and your father has killed the fattened calf. We are celebrating because of his safe return. The older brother was angry and wouldn't go in, and his father came out and begged him. But he replied, all these years I've slaved for you and never once refused to do a single thing you told me to. I've done everything right. All that time you never gave me even one young goat for a feast with my friends. Yet when this son of yours comes back, after squandering your money on prostitutes, you celebrate by killing the fattened calf. His father said to him, look, my son, you have always stayed with me, and everything I have is yours. We had to celebrate this happy day, for your brother was dead, and he's come back to life. He's lost, but now he's found. The father comes out, and he invites the older brother into the party, and he says, I love you, and I want you to share in my joy. I want you to experience the joy that I feel that your younger brother has returned. The older brother is so offended that he isn't the center of attention, that he refuses to join the party that his father is throwing. And I just want to pause and think about this scene for a minute. The older brother complains that he never got a party. And the dad says, there's a party right now. Come into the party. We didn't just kill a goat, we killed a calf. This is the best meat that you could possibly get. And you're just out here not eating the meat. You're not partying. You're not celebrating. You see, the older brother isn't mad that he'd never had any parties. He's mad that he isn't the center of attention. Like, dude, this is like a 40, 50-year-old man. Do you hear what I'm saying? Like, can you imagine being this sulking and petulant? And Jesus is doing this to the Pharisees on purpose. He's like, dudes, come on. Your younger brother. Don't you want to party? Look, he's back. And the reason that Jesus is doing this is to reveal to them, and I think to a lot of us, that we're the older brother in the story. And he's telling them, this is why I love Jesus. Oh, he's brilliant. Because in the story of Jacob, how does the older brother react when his lost brother comes home? When Esau sees the man that stole God's blessing from him, that cheated him out of the blessing of their family God, Esau had every reason to kill him where he stood. But he is so thrilled that his younger brother has come back home that he runs, embraces him, weeps, and kisses him. To the Pharisees, and there's even more going on with this story. Esau became the father of the Edomites. The Edomites were the bad guys in Israel's history, okay? So all of Esau's children became the people that oppressed Israel in the centuries after this story takes place. And so when the people of Israel look at Esau, they look down on him as a barbarian, all right? You're an uneducated, you're stupid, you're a wild man who lives out in the fields. And Jesus is pointing out even the father of the Edomites ran out, hugged, and embraced his brother when he came back home. You don't even live up to the love of a barbarian like Esau. Like the conviction. Jesus is not like poking fun. This isn't like a political insult that you see on TV. This is the fundamentals of your entire approach to life, Pharisees, are busted. All right? Your failure to love your younger brothers and sisters is such an intense flaw that even Esau understood this more than you do. As we read the story of the prodigal son, we've been trained to ask the question, which of the sons am I? But that isn't the point of the story. Jesus is pointing out this story so that 2,000 years later we can leave the sanctuary on. He's not doing this, so we leave the sanctuary asking, which son am I? Whole reason Jesus is telling this story to the Pharisees is because he wants to invite them to become something more than a petulant, whiny younger brother who sits outside the party. He's inviting them into the party. He's saying, come and celebrate with me. I want you. But if you're gonna act this way, that attitude needs to change. I'm not gonna change the party for you, older brother. I want you to be a part of the party because I love you. And it's the same for us. Instead of asking the question, which brother am I? Jesus is inviting the Pharisees and you and me to become more than just the younger brother or just the older brother. And when I was talking to Pastor Steve about this story, he said something, and I love it. It was beautiful. He said, I imagine the day after the party. What's going on in the younger brother's head when he wakes up? He's welcome home. There's this amazing party, and he wakes up and he says, now what do I do? I'm back home. I'm in my father's house. I don't have an inheritance. I gave that up, but I'm here. I could be back eating pig slop. Like I could be enslaved back in foreign lands, but I'm home right now. I'm just going to enjoy it. I'm going to live it up. I'm going to serve my father and my brother, and I am going to work with the joy that I have been brought back home. And the story doesn't end with any conclusion to the story of the older brother. It's open-ended. And because he's inviting us to finish the story ourselves, Jesus is inviting us to become the Father. Being the oldest son in the ancient world is about filling the shoes of your father. If you're going to receive everything that your father has, it is incumbent upon you to become the responsible man that your father is. If you're going to carry the weight of your father's wealth, you have to carry the weight of your father's wealth. You have to fill his shoes. You have to become like him. One day your father would die, and you would get everything he has, and you would become the father to your sons. And when I think of what the father is doing, so when the father leaves the party to come speak to the older brother, the weight of that action that he's taking. Because the younger brother, he says, Dad, I've done everything you expected of me. I am ready to fill your shoes. And the father comes out. And he says, technically you are ready to fill my shoes. Everything I have is yours. You have always been beside me. But your heart, the older brother is a bigger tragedy in my mind than the younger brother. Because the younger brother ran away. He experienced physical and emotional separation from his father. The older brother stayed. He had physical access to his father, physical connection to his father. But he had blocked himself from receiving his father's love. On the outside, he was just like his father, but his heart was far from him. He didn't understand why his father could love the younger brother so intensely. And he chose to remove himself, physically remove himself, to represent what was going on inside of his heart. Could you imagine, maybe you don't have to imagine this. Maybe this has been true in your own life, where you have had physical connection to the people that you're supposed to love, but for whatever reason you have blocked them out. And what the father is doing when he comes out to the older brother is he is saying, would you soften your heart enough to experience my love for you and your brother? Would you let me in? He's trying, and in doing that, softening yourself and letting the Father in, you are becoming like the Father, because the Father's heart is soft and tender, and all he desires is his children. And it's enough that they're present. He loves them so much. And to become like the Father is to embrace that love. And Jesus is telling us and the Pharisees, if you want to be like me, you need to love your brothers and sisters as I love them, welcome them the way Esau welcomed them, embrace them the way Esau embraced them. This story feels confrontational, but it's an invitation for them to join Jesus' ministry. He's asking them to be disciples. The people that he criticized most, he loved. I want to point this out, man. Jesus would go after the Pharisees because he loved them so much. He's like, you have physical access. You are right here at the temple, worshiping and serving. But man, he wants you. That's what matters in this story. You can have physical connectedness to God and emotional distance. And if you aren't convinced that Jesus is inviting them to join his ministry in Genesis 33, Jacob says, what a relief when he sees his older brother coming out and loving him. It is like seeing the face of God, Whose face does the younger brother see when he's loved by his older brother? He sees the face of the Father. When Esau loves Jacob, Jacob sees his dead father's face, loving him and embracing him, the face of God. And we're invited to be that face. Henry Nouwen wrote a beautiful book called The Return of the Prodigal Son, and it's written about that painting that I showed you in the beginning. He spent 2 days in St. Petersburg in the Soviet Union studying this painting. And if that sounds like a really long time to sit in front of a painting, you're absolutely right. And everyone in the museum was like, what is this crazy guy doing? But he literally went to this painting, sat in front of it, and meditated on it for 2 days. And then many, many years later, he wrote a book about the meditations that he'd had and kind of how this had transformed his relationship with God and how it had transformed his relationship with who God was calling him to become. And I just want to share a really powerful section from this book. He says, why pay so much attention to the sons in this story when it is the Father who is the center? And when it is the Father with whom I am to identify? Why talk so much about being like the sons in this story when the real question is, are you interested in being like the Father? It feels somehow good to be able to say, these sons are like me. It gives me a sense of being understood. But how does it feel to say the Father is like me? Do I want to be like the Father? Do I want to be not just the one who is being forgiven, but also the one who forgives, not just the one who is being welcomed home, but also the one who welcomes home, not just the one who receives compassion, but the one who offers it as well? Whether I am the younger or the older son, I am the son of my compassionate Father. I am an heir. And this whole sermon is based off of this book. And Paul supports the core message of this book in Romans 8. He says, you have not received a spirit that makes you fearful slaves. Instead, you received God's Spirit when He adopted you as His own children. Now we call Him Abba, Father, for His Spirit joins with our spirit to affirm that we are His children. And since we are His children, we are His heirs. In fact, together with Christ, we are heirs of God's glory, but if we want to share in His glory, we have to share in His suffering. We have to become like our Father. And suffering isn't a great sales pitch. If you want to get people in seats and pews, that's not what you do from the pulpit. But that is what the Father did. You see, when Jacob cheated his father and his brother Isaac, he destroyed his relationship with his father. Isaac never got to see Jacob again. He never got to see Jacob's children. And the only thing I can imagine that would be like is grief. Grief not only for his loss, but for the fact that his two sons were enemies. That Esau and Isaac, as he's dying and passing away, Esau's relationship with Jacob is non-existent anymore. And the first of three ways I think that we can become like our Father is grief. And my relationship with grief has changed in the past couple of years. I grew up in the suburbs. And one of the really easy things about the suburbs is everyone's in their boxes and they don't touch each other. Our lives were contained. You didn't have to deal with other people's problems that often if you didn't want to. You could just sit in your house, do what you wanted, keep your own business. And in the 2.5 years since we've moved down into the city, there's a different status quo in the city because you can't ignore other people's problems when you live in the city. You see them everywhere, and you rub up against them everywhere. And it has changed my relationship with grief, because before I could ignore other people's problems and I didn't have to feel anything. I could just stay focused on my own life. But now when I'm driving on the frontage roads alongside 94 and I see these Muslim women who have school-aged children during school hours that are begging with them, I feel grief. Because I'm like, these little girls aren't getting educated. What kind of a life can you have if you don't know how to read? And for whatever reason, and I don't understand their circumstance enough to comment on it, but for whatever reason, they feel like this is the only option that they have at this moment in time. They have to do this with their daughters or their sons. And I know I can't fix it, that I'm powerless to do anything about it, and I feel grief for their circumstance. And I see people, man, the number of people that my heart breaks, because I see people whose lives have driven them to find comfort in something that enslaves them. And I see the impacts of addiction everywhere I go. When I drive past the liquor store and I see bullet holes in the side of it on University. When I see people bent over because they're high on fentanyl. And I know there's nothing that I can do to rescue them. I feel grief. And the father, when he loses his children, he feels grief. And if we are to become like the father, we have to enter into his pain first. Pain at the sin and the brokenness in our world. We can't hide from it. We can't ignore it. We can't talk it away and try to blame somebody else. And when we see the sin in our own life, in the way that we've damaged God's beautiful world, the only proper response first is to feel grief. And I know this isn't something that you're going to walk out if you're excited to do. But I think if we're going to become like the Father, we have to enter into his grief. The next is to enter into his forgiveness. And the Father's forgiveness is so whole and complete that the younger son in both of our stories doesn't understand what's happening. Okay, Jacob is so what is going on? He's shocked, he's confused, and in the back of his mind, he's like, okay, Esau's hugging me, he's kissing me, he's making this public display of his love. But I think he's probably going to trick me. He's probably doing this so that I let my guard down. Jacob is so unfamiliar with the love of the Father that forgiveness scares him. That is how complete Esau's forgiveness was. It was terrifying. Esau just wanted his relationship with his brother back. He's like, and I didn't put this in my notes, but he said, one of the first things after their embrace and their hug, he looked at all of Jacob's children and he said, who are these? Who are these little ones that I haven't met yet? Who are my nieces and nephews? Let me meet them. He wanted to bring Jacob's family into his family. He wanted them to be reunited, not just physically, but emotionally. And that is what forgiveness is about. It is not about keeping the peace. And in Minnesota, I think we rush to forgiveness more than a lot of other people because we value stability and peace more than we value relationships. So we'll smile and nod. And we'll put on a show of forgiveness when we don't really want it. And you can't rush into this. For true forgiveness is close to impossible. And it's something, when Jesus spoke about it, he said, you need to forgive a person 70 times 7 times. And it's hyperbole. He's saying you just need to keep forgiving them until you can stop forgiving them. Until it's true forgiveness. Until your relationship can be repaired. And I think that can make us uncomfortable. Because if I forgive someone that wholly and completely, they could hurt me again. If Esau truly brought Jacob back into his family, Jacob could cheat him again. He could steal from him again. That powerlessness is not exciting. That danger is not exciting. But that is what Jesus entered into. And if we can't achieve it in this life, we can pray that he starts it in this life at least. That we desire relationship with the people who have hurt us in such a way. True forgiveness is in our hearts, the way it was in the Father's heart. And the third way is generosity. And this will preach real easy, right? Generosity we can preach, because generosity is about a party, right? We can preach a party. We can get up here and celebrate and dance and say, come on in. We will feed you. We will party with you. We desire your presence and we want to have fun with you. And the Father is generous with the younger son. And the generosity is an extension of his forgiveness. When the younger son comes home after his long journey away in the wilderness, the father puts the family ring on him. He puts the family cloak on him. He puts new clean shoes on his feet. It's as if he is instantly restored to his former status just by coming back home. He didn't do anything. The younger son didn't do anything. He didn't work to earn the ring. He didn't work to earn the clothes. It's just, boom, you're back. Welcome to the family again. Let's party. Let's go kill some calves. Let's go celebrate. Break out the best wine. You're back. And church, I don't feel like I need to pitch this to you. We like to have fun. But you can give to people through your time if you don't have the wealth. You can give to people in your service. You can give to people in your attention, as we are generous as our Heavenly Father has been generous towards us. So just to kind of close things out this morning, we're going to be going into communion in a minute. Jesus uses the story of Jacob as a foundational building element in his parable of the prodigal son. Asking which sibling am I when you encounter this story is the wrong question, because Jesus is inviting you to become the Father. That is the calling he's placing on your life. Become like me. And in Romans 8:17, Paul says, since we are his children, we are his heirs. In fact, together with Christ, we are the heirs of God's glory. And you're invited to imitate the Father in three ways: through grief, forgiveness, and generosity. And if I could have the worship band come up. So Bethel Christian Fellowship, it is my prayer this morning that you would go and that you would receive the fatherly love that God has for you, and that you would become it. That you would embody his fatherly and motherly love for the children that he has in this world. And that your identity as his child would only be temporary as you become more and more in touch with his heart, more and more like him. Father, would you move in our hearts, and would you move us into this world? In your name, amen. You're welcome to stay and worship with us.